Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the RAF Museum in the Midlands. Today we're delighted to have a talk on the Aden Protectorate Levies, which is going to be given to us by Dr Huw Bennett and Dr Edward Burke. Now Huw is a reader in international relations at Cardiff University, and he specialises in strategic studies, military history and intelligence studies. He writes on aspects of British defence since 1945, and his first book, Fighting the Mau Mau, the British Army and Counter-insurgency in the Kenya Emergency, was published by the Cambridge University Press in 2012. And he's currently completing a book for Cambridge on British military strategy in Northern Ireland in the early 1970s. Sounds fascinating, I've got to say, Huw. And Dr Edward Burke is an associate professor in international relations and director of the Centre for Conflict, Security and Terrorism at the University of Nottingham, specialising in insurgency, terrorism and political violence. In May 2020, Edward commenced a 2-year fellowship funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council on paramilitary violence, and his book, Army of Tribes, British Army Cohesion, Deviancy and Murder in Northern Ireland, was published by Liverpool University Press. His work has also been published in Terrorism and Political Violence, the Journal of Imperial Commonwealth History, Prism and Rusi Journal. So I think it's going to be a really fascinating lecture. Really pleased we've got a great online audience for it. So I'm going to hand over to Huw, and I believe he's then going to hand to Edward and back to Huw again. So we're going to have a bit of a relay. But Huw, please come on up stage.
Great, hello everybody. It's a real privilege to be here. Thank you very much, Harry, for introducing us and for inviting us. I always like to talk in a venue that has some resonance with the topic, and being in this kind of bunker-like lecture theatre seems quite apt. What we're going to talk about today is it's a first foray for me personally into the world of the Royal Air Force. So I'm really thrilled to be sort of moving into this research area and to be here in the RAF Museum to talk about it. As Harry mentioned, a lot of my work has been on British Army counterinsurgency, but this is a really interesting case study in a conflict for looking at those inter-service relationships and the relationship between the Army and the Air Force in particular. There's lots of things that are very specific to this conflict that Ed and I are going to talk about. There's lots of very kind of expert intricacies of South Arabia, of the different tribes, of the politics involved there. And we're coming to this fresh, really. We're still learning about the politics of this region. So we're very much looking forward to the questions that we're going to get as well, as we think about how we can take this research forward in the next few years. But what this topic is also about, really, beyond the particularities of Aden and the protectorates in the 1950s, is firstly, as I said, it's about the political relations between the services. And of course, that's something that's still very important to this present day as well, the politics of rivalry between the services. And secondly, is the position of local allies in especially counterinsurgency operations, but I think in many other different types of conflict as well. So we're very interested in particular in these Aden Protectorate levies and what happened with these levies, how they behaved, what impact they had on strategy is something that is relevant to today as well, I think. So we are going to get into quite a lot of detail about Aden in the 1950s. Ed is going to give us the detail on that. My job first, though, is to talk about some of the bigger context, so that we can situate this study and understand its kind of wider relevance at the time and today. Okay, this is to give us some idea of the part of the world that we're talking about. Now, today this is Yemen, present day Yemen, which of course for anyone like us wanting to conduct research makes it very difficult because there's a war going on in Yemen. So there's a lot of research that we would like to do in Yemen itself, in archives there, interviewing people, for example, that currently is very difficult or impossible. Now, most people will have heard of Aden. This was the major urban area in South Arabia. The major kind of concern for the British throughout this period was Aden. Very important economically, strategically, but there was a large hinterland as well connected to Aden. okay, which the British increasingly felt a responsibility to control, to secure, and to protect. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is really to do with that relationship between the centre, the core interest of the British state was Aden. The port facilities for naval purposes, the air base nearby, which I'll come on to a minute, were very important for regional security. So the relationship between Aden and then the wider protectorates. And there was a growing, sneaking suspicion amongst officials based in Aden, in the colonial service, in the military, from the Foreign Office, that if things were allowed to get out of control in the protectorates, if there was considerable insecurity and instability in these protectorates, then ultimately, in one way or another, it would have a knock-on effect on Aden itself. So that's really the reason why we're talking about these more rural areas, because of the assumed relationship between them and Aden itself. Okay. Now, that's not to say that these rural areas were completely unimportant on their own terms. Of course, something else that's going on in this period, from the interwar period through to the post-Second World War years, is there's growing oil exploration in the Middle East, throughout the Middle East, and including starting to happen in some of these areas too. So there is an awareness in official circles that these rural areas may actually, in the longer term, become extremely important in their own right, and not only because of their proximity to Aden port and to the air base there. So that's, if you like, the reason why this whole region was of concern to people at the time, and why we're looking at it today. Now, there was a division, as you can see, hopefully you can see, between the eastern and the western protectorates. Each had their own kind of official structures of political officers responsible for different parts of those protectorates, reporting back to Aden. And today we're going to be looking at the Western Protectorate. So there were security issues in the East as well. There were things going on in the Eastern Protectorates that were of concern at this time. There were occasional military operations, use of air power and so on. But we're going to be focusing mainly on the Western Protectorate, and especially around the area of Nisab. Now, I hope that's the correct pronunciation. Nisab is the major area we're going to be thinking about around here, where the action was taking place. In this, this was the capital, Nisab was the capital of the Upper Olaki Sultanate. So various different sultanates and tribal configurations within the protectorates, and we're going to be looking at the one around that Nisab area. The whole of this Western Protectorate, the population was estimated to be about 350,000. So quite a sparsely populated area, right? Very rugged terrain, very difficult to control in military terms, very limited systematic control by police forces, for example. The Eastern Protectorate was slightly bigger, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000, just for comparison's sake. Now, the British had been in Aden since 1839 and had gradually consolidated their control over the city and then over the hinterland behind as well. Between 1937 and 1963, Aden itself was a crown colony. From 1963, the British created a federation of South Arabia, which the aim was to try and connect the city to the former protectorates, to create a federation in much the same way that federations had been created in West Africa, in East Africa, in other parts of the British Empire. Federation was seen as a way of bringing about a type of end of empire that would still suit British interests and that would create political stability. So that's what comes later, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end as well. Now, what had been going on in the rural areas in the meantime was that these were not, strictly speaking, direct colonies. Rather, the British had protective treaties with the rulers, with the tribal rulers, such as the sultans, in these different parts of the protectorates. And those protective treaties normally gave the British the right to overthrow the ruler. If it was considered that the ruler was a very unwise person, very temperamental, was not acting in the best interests of his people, it was always a he, of course, then the British had the right under those protection treaties to overthrow and to replace, and that did occasionally happen. But the picture here really is one of a patchwork, right? That's what I'm getting at. So a patchwork of these protective treaties with the different rulers, where each really depended upon the personal relations between the political officers involved and those rulers. The other thing to point out on this slide, I think I'll come back to it in a moment, the other important feature of the British presence in South Arabia as a whole is the relationship with what was north, which was Yemen, the imamate of Yemen. There was a revolution in the Yemen in 1962 by republicans, so it became a republic, and then eventually after the British left Aden in 1967, the republicans merged north and the south into what is now Yemen. But in the period that we're looking at, and in fact right back to the beginning of the British presence, there had been a long history of dispute between the British and their local allies and the Yemenis. And at various points there'd been treaties, there'd been agreements to try and stabilise the border, to agree on what the border even was, where was the border, what did it mean in legal terms. But it kept coming back again and again and again as a very problematic border, and the British were quite often involved in covert action over the border, for example. So there's been a number of really great studies by Spencer Morby at Nottingham and others on how the British, for example, they picked allied tribes that sat astride the border, and they armed them with rifles to go and basically stir up trouble in the Yemen and to cause disorder and discontent. And the Yemenis were doing it right back to the British as well. So it was going on from both sides. And this was going on for decades and decades. So that's part of the kind of the regional context of what's happening in South Arabia in this time. Those protective treaties, but it's really unlike some of the other possessions of Britain in the colonial period. It's very clear that outside of this small, very important strategic port down here, Britain never really had firm control over very large parts of the country. And that really becomes clear as we get into the detail of what was happening operationally later on. Now, the other important contextual factor to talk about briefly, and I do this as a self-confessed army expert, not an Air Force expert, so I'm not going to get myself in lots of trouble by saying things that are wrong about the Air Force at the Air Force Museum. But it's important to point out that from quite early on, there had been a history of some tension between the Army and the Air Force about who was really in charge in Aden and in the protectorates. Right. So the Air Force had been in Aden since about 1928, and of course this is in the broader regional context of the expansion of the Royal Air Force in the Middle East, especially after the First World War. So what happens after the First World War, of course, is that both the French and the British empires, because of seizure of German territory, for example, they both expand in the Middle East. At the same time as they're demobilising from the First World War, There's severe economic problems in France and Britain. So there's a big resource question about how on earth are we going to control these new territories when we possibly don't have the manpower to do it. And one of the solutions there, one of the central solutions in British Middle East strategy was, of course, the Air Force, to use air policing. Now, air policing has been very extensively studied. It's quite a controversial topic. What it actually entailed. Was it a very barbarous method of maintaining control? Was it not? Has that been exaggerated? You know, this is a kind of a hot historical topic. But really, for the British at the time, it worked. It was very cheap compared to the alternative of, you know, posting whole brigades or divisions of troops in Iraq, in different parts of the Middle East. It was much cheaper to use the Air Force in this fashion. And of course, you know, there's because it's more controversial and sort of exciting, there's often an emphasis upon the most destructive aspects of air policing. So air policing, what it really meant in practice was coordination between the Air Force as the kind of the blunt edge, the blunt force of British power, and then the local political advisors, either the political advisors from the Colonial Office or from the Foreign Office, and trying to use a combination of persuasion on the one hand, trying to persuade local tribal leaders to cooperate with British aims, and then if they refused to cooperate, then the Air Force being there as the kind of stark reminder that the British had power to enforce their will. And this, you know, could, of course, escalate through a range of tactics, from dropping leaflets to try and persuade people to do what the local political officers wanted, through to destroying crops, bombing property, and so on, punitive raids. So this is just to say, you know, this was the kind of general practice and capability of British forces throughout the Middle East, and that kind of practice extended into Aden, South Arabia as well. Okay. Now, got to hope, I don't know how that, yeah. Ed found all the pictures. None of the lovely pictures are my responsibility. I have to give him credit for that. Now, I was talking before about the strategic significance of Aden. From the Air Force perspective, it's really largely about this base, about Cormaxa. Again, forgive my appalling mispronunciation if I got it wrong. RAF Cormaxa. Now, this is a very significant base. It can be used as a base, yes, for the air policing that I was just talking about, for that kind of maintenance of colonial control in one way or another, but it's also can be used for conventional warfare, can be used for threatening Cold War adversaries with attack, and so on. So by the 1950s, this is the biggest, the busiest RAF airfield in the world, according to the sources that we've read. If that's wrong, then we'd be happy to be corrected about that. But there are about 5,000 air movements a month by the mid-1950s from this base. So, you know, this is another reason why Aden matters to British global strategy. Now, I'm going to build on that with a couple of points. Two things I want to talk about here. Firstly, the Middle East in the Cold War, and secondly, this use of local allies in colonial policy, which Aden is a very interesting example of. Now, there is an easy temptation to look at these things separately and to say, you know, the Cold War is one thing, the Cold War is about Europe, or it's about the Pacific, it's about the superpowers and nuclear weapons and so on. And then there's colonial history, which happens in places like Aden or Kenya and so on. And that's on a much lower scale, and it's completely different people thinking about it and so on. That we're arguing absolutely against that. We're looking at the interactions between Cold War and colonial. So on the Cold War front, of course, it had been very evident to British strategists, to politicians, to officials, to military commanders from the Second World War that the Middle East was crucial to British survival. right? Because of oil, because of shipping lanes, because of the connection to the Mediterranean and so on, Britain couldn't survive in a global conflict without the Middle East playing a very significant role. So that lesson from the Second World War was, of course, carried over into the 1950s. And many of the same people who'd been having these thoughts in the 1940s were around in the 1950s as well. So you bring the people with the ideas. The two things are not entirely separate. So in British post-war defence planning, for example, if we look at defence plans or plans for World War III, if you like, the priorities in the late 1940s were, number one, UK, defence of the homeland, right? That's the number one priority. Air defence, for example, how do you defend the UK against Soviet bomber attack? Can you defend it? Do you have a civil defence programme, air raid shelters and so on? Second priority, sea lines of communication. UK then is now very heavily reliant upon imports, food imports and so on. So how do you secure the sea lines of communication? And global strategy priority number 3 was the Middle East. Okay, so which is surprising because you might think war fighting in Europe or Germany or something would be kind of higher up the priorities. But at that time in the late 1940s, the Middle East was ranked higher. Okay. I've mentioned already the oil factor too that's relevant in terms of the Middle East. This is a period when the British economy is very heavily reliant upon oil, and we know from today how energy politics can affect foreign policy, of course, in a different sense. And Aden's, in strictly military terms, or defence terms rather, became more important as time went on, from the 1940s through to the 1960s, not less important. And that was largely because of Egypt and Nasser and Arab nationalism trying to push the British out of Egypt and other territories in the Middle East. So the main base for British forces in the Middle East in the Second World War and afterwards in the early Cold War was, of course, Egypt, large airfields in Egypt, as well as the army bases. And some of the early Cold War defence plans were actually that if World War III broke out, that the British would strike. The main ability to strike at the Soviet Union would be from air bases in Egypt, using strategic bombers, right? Firstly with conventional munitions, and then with nuclear weapons when those became available. So Egypt was very important. Of course, there was resistance to the British presence, and then, especially after the Suez Crisis in 1956, there was a recognition in defence circles that the British defence presence in the Middle East was going to have to be somewhere else. And that meant Cyprus, but then there was an insurgency in Cyprus in the mid-1950s. So then it also, and increasingly, meant Aden. Excellent defence facilities in Aden and at RAF Comaxa and so on. So that's the kind of the regional strategic picture. Now, what also was recognised in this period, if we look at one example, was in the 1952 global strategy paper that was produced by the Chiefs of Staff. Okay, so kind of similar to an equivalent to the more recent integrated review, if you like, an attempt to look at strategy in the round. And the chiefs in 1952, the Chiefs of Staff of the Armed Forces, they of course put a lot of emphasis upon nuclear weapons. What would the effect of the nuclear age be on Britain as a country and on the defence of Britain? But they also expected that because of nuclear weapons, that would make conventional warfighting less likely between the superpowers, especially because the risks were too great. That because of that, there'd actually be an increase in lower intensity conflict. And they turned out to be right about that. That is exactly what happened. They expected there to be more subversion, to be more propaganda, and to be more insurgency. And this is what affected the British in the Middle East in the 1950s and in other parts of the world as well, of course. This is why the Malaya emergency is still, in full flood at that time too. Now, the British recognised, both in this post-war period that we're talking about today, but really earlier as well, that local allies were going to be essential to dealing with these kinds of threats, because they didn't have the resources to control all of these territories on their own. They needed local assistance. There are two things that local allies bring. The first one I've just mentioned is sheer numbers, really, the manpower. So if you can recruit people into the Aden Protectorate Levies, into the Malay regiments, into the Home Guard in Kenya, for example, during the Kenya insurgency, then it's going to massively increase the pool of resources, the manpower available to commanders trying to deal with unrest or insurgency. But the other crucial thing that local allies can bring, of course, is knowledge, which is dangerous because they might manipulate that knowledge or just tell you what they think you should hear rather than the whole truth. So there's the danger there. There's a bit of risk, but especially if you've got large armed forces, you don't necessarily have the capacity to teach all of your officers Arabic. It takes a long time to learn a foreign language. If you've got local allies who can bring you that expertise, who can help you understand those very complicated tribal dynamics, for example, around Aden, very difficult to understand the different tribal systems and so on. If you can actually talk to people and have them on your side who understand those tribal systems, then it's a very significant advantage. Now, something that Ed and I have argued, building on existing kind of scholarship on this field, is that it's helpful to think about that relationship as a bargain, right? That when you start to cooperate with these local security forces, with local allies, then it's always quite tentative. It's never a sort of a cast iron guarantee that that relationship will always be stable and it will always operate on the same basis. Because both parties to that bargain, you coming in as the metropolitan force from the UK or from France or anywhere else, you've got your constituency back home that you have to kind of report to or that you have to satisfy, but the local allies have theirs as well. So if you're dealing with a tribal leader, for example, then the tribal leader will need the consent of the tribe in one form or another. It could be quite an authoritarian leader, but will still need to consider the opinion of the tribe. So there's always the possibility of that bargain moving or breaking completely. And that's what we're trying to look at in this case study, is how that bargain was negotiated and renegotiated over time, not a static thing that always remained the same. Okay, so this negotiated idea about that relationship is quite helpful. Now, to give you one very specific example of this, in the Aden Protectorate Levies, this is what we're going to get into the detail of, those soldiers in the Aden Protectorate Levies were recruited from the tribes in the protectorates. And part of the bargain between those who enlisted and between their British commanders, part of the understood bargain and the deal was that they would not be used on operations in their own area. They would not be asked to go and fight against their own people and to make a choice between their loyalty to the British and their loyalty to their own families. That would never be asked of them. That they would only ever be used outside of their own tribal areas. So do you see what I mean? That's a kind of example of the type of negotiation that could be involved. Right? That there was kind of a conditional loyalty rather than the absolute loyalty that we might expect of, let's say, professional service personnel who sign up to the RAF. You sign up to the RAF, you're signing your on the dotted line, and you will follow orders. There will be no discussion about the politics of the orders. You will follow the orders. So what I'm saying is that for these colonial forces, that was not exactly the same situation by any means. And that this had an impact on the strategy, on what the commanders and the political leaders in Aden and in the protectorates could do with those forces. They had to take it into account. And we're going to look at an example where they didn't take it into account enough and it came back to bite them, and they saw what the implications of that could be. Okay, so I'm going to say a little bit more about the levies themselves and about what they started to be used for, and then Ed is going to get into some of that detail. So just to say, there'd been this tradition of sort of rivalry between the RAF and especially the regiment and the British Army over Aden, over who was in charge of the levies, this locally raised force. Now, the levies in the period that we're looking at numbered about 1,200, 1,300. That's the kind of size of force we're looking at. So it's pretty small. Now, later on, in the early 1960s, when the Federation was created, it was turned into the Federal Regular Army, and then it was expanded. So it was bigger at that period. I think there ended up being 5 battalions of the Federal Regular Army plus support services. So it did grow over time. In this period, it was about 1,200, 1,300, roughly. And modelled, as many of these colonial forces were, you can say the same of the forces used in East Africa, for example, modelled on the Indian Army. The Indian Army was seen as the great kind of exemplar of how to have very effective relations between British officers, British leadership, white British leadership, and locally recruited other ranks, and how to be sensitive to cultural differences. It was seen, the Indian Army was seen as a success in that sense. Now, this formation, the Aden Protectorate Levies, became more under the control of the Royal Air Force. This kind of tension between the Air Force and the Army was resolved in a tragic way after riots that broke out in Aden in 1947. Now, the riots were to do with the conflict going on in Israel-Palestine, the emergence of Israel as an independent state at that time, and they were ethnic riots, Arab Jewish riots and violence. The levies were sent in, and they, according to the official report, in trying to suppress the riots, they killed 31 civilians. So this caused quite a degree of controversy. There was an official inquiry and report into it, and one of the conclusions was that there needed to be a firmer grip by the leadership on the levies. So as a result of that, the RAF regiment were put in charge of the APL. Okay, and that kind of moment will come back later on, because as you can imagine, not everyone in the army in Aden was thrilled about that switch of control, and to them perhaps a sense of humiliation of having this taken away from them. Now, the final thing I'll talk about, because this is what starts to happen and starts to unsettle the situation in the period that we're looking at, is the forward policy, which really was a kind of adaptation of what the British had been thinking about in earlier decades in India and Afghanistan. And we've chosen, this is Kennedy Travaskis, who wasn't actually the governor at this time, but he was involved in the application of the forward policy in the protectorates. And he became the governor later on. And his diaries, he has quite an ambivalent position on the forward policy. At one moment saying, oh, it was a disaster and we should never have done it. And the next moment advocating it and saying it was a wonderful way to proceed. So this goes back really to what I was talking about at the beginning, about that connection between Aden port and the protectorates and the hinterland, and instability in the countryside affecting the city. The solution from the local colonial officials, and a lot of this was kind of generated by the people on the ground. There was minimal oversight from London. London was fairly happy to let people in Aden get on with it and make their own decisions. Their solution to this problem was to have a forward policy, basically pushing British power and control from Aden further and further out, as far up towards the border with Yemen as possible. And this is going on at the same time as those covert operations into Yemen itself are happening. So the two are really quite connected. What this means in practical terms is increasing the physical manifestations of British power. And the place that we're going to be talking about, I mean, this is going on elsewhere as well, but we're going to talk about it in one particular place, is the decision to build a road. Of course, roads, from the Romans onwards, are a way of sort of transporting military forces and power through the Wadi Hatib, which was territory of the Rabitsi tribe. And crucially, the Sultan agreed to this road being built, but without widespread consent from the population. So, this, I think, illustrates this great difficulty for the British, and they're trying to control the protectorates through these treaties and these arrangements with the people that they think are the rulers, the tribal chiefs. Same kind of idea as used in Africa and India and elsewhere. But actually, there's often quite a big question mark over how much authority these supposed rulers actually have amongst their people. Are they really credible figures at all? So what ends up happening is that this forward policy of sort of assertion of dominance by the British comes to be very destabilising, and that is where Ed is going to take over. Thanks.
Thank you, Hugh. So it's my job to essentially flip things a little bit from the strategic to the tactical, but to illustrate exactly what Hugh was saying in terms of how a local bargain that happens during an insurgency with an ostensibly loyalist force, the Aden Protectorate Levies, can end up shifting, moving, and then having significant strategic effect, not only within the British military, but also with regards to British policy in South Arabia. Now, the region, as Hugh said, that we're going to talk about particularly is the Upper Aulaki Sultanate. Now, this today is known as Shabwa. And actually today, of course, the United Arab Emirates is very much involved in conflict there, but also US Special Forces and UK Special Forces have recently been involved in operations in the same region. The theme for the last 70 years that has driven much of the conflict in the Upper Aulaki or Shabwa is the centralization of the state, whether it be from Aden or whether it be from the Yemeni capital of Sana'a. And what we see persistently is that the same tribal confederations actively and violently resist these efforts of centralized state building or the exertion of control within their territory. And even today, the road that I'm going to talk about that was first proposed by the British in 1951, that major road has never been built, although there's been at least 7 major efforts to do so. So what we see is successive conflicts even after the British leave in terms of trying to build these logistical communications to, again, empower the state, Aden or indeed Sana'a. And the tribe I'm particularly going to be talking about is not a very well-known or very large tribe, but is the Rabitsi Confederation, which had control of a valley, the Wadi Hatib, in the Upper Aulaki Sultanate. And when in 1951 then, the colonial government decided to enter the Upper Aulaki, as they called it, for the first time, i.e. they had a treaty with the Sultan, but there was no permanent political officer present, there was no government guards present or no Aden Protectorate Levies presence in the capital, Nisab. But as part of the forward policy, once the decision was made to advance this, it was seen as deemed as necessary to essentially garrison Nisab with this type of British control from Aden. The Sultan didn't want it initially, but when it was pointed out to him that he would now have control over territories over which he didn't at that point control at all, including the Wadi Hatib, it sounded more appealing to him, in that the Aden government guaranteed him some rent in terms of, for example, taxing commercial travellers, traders that were using the Wadi Hatib, so that ultimately the Sultan would take power away from the Rebizi tribe and then put it in his own capital, in his own treasury. So that was essentially seen as that softened the blow in terms of losing his hitherto large amounts of local autonomy. So Huw has already said that the population of the Western Aden Protectorate at this point was approximately sort of 350,000. The Upper Aulaki was one of the least populated sultanates. So to some extent, to a large extent, really, the major British contact with this region was through the recruitment to the APL prior to 1951. This is because political agents or officers like Lord Belhaven in the 1930s, when he was setting up the levies, really admired the martial Bedouin qualities of the Aulaki people and their fierce independence, which he regarded as being particularly warrior-like. So the Aulakis then made up a very disproportionate part of the levies in the early years of its existence. And it was also seen as highly conducive. You could use the Aulakis to conduct operations near the immediate hinterland of Aden itself, because they didn't have much sort of ethnic or tribal links to other areas. So essentially using these frontiersmen sort of beyond the wall, so to speak, of formal Aden control was seen as extremely useful. Here was a martial population that could be recruited then for the levies. Now, the rebellion by the Rebizi was in response to a British decision then to construct this road through the Wadi Hatib, which would link the towns of Lodar and Atak. So essentially a spine or an axis, a major road that would consolidate British control close to the frontier with Yemen. Now, Frank Edwards, who served as a British military intelligence officer in Saudi Arabia, outlined the status quo in the Wadi Hatib, essentially that before the road building commenced. So the fort in the village in the Wadi was in a village called Robat. It was controlled by a leader of the Ahl Shams, or Shamsi section of the Rebizi tribe. His name was Salim Ali Mahwar, who British officials quickly then named as Sam. The authority of the Sultan had never, as I said, really extended to the Hatib before. And after the idea was that after the British had secured the Wadi, they would then build a series of government guards posts. Customs revenue would flow not only to Aden but also to the Sultan. And so they commenced then the road building from the Sultan's capital, Nisab, and by late 1953 they reached the top of the ridge overlooking the very steep, very mountainous Wadi Hatib. And two local tribes sent protest letters to Aden, the Damani tribe and the Rebizis, and they threatened an insurgency. Now, the political officer in Nisab at this time, George Henderson, presumed that this was simply a request for a bribe, and that the local tribesmen were being used by the Yemenis. Henderson was pretty convinced that the Rebizi, who were a relatively small tribe, they had approximately, he believed, sort of somewhere between 50 and 60 fighters, were lacking in status, and indeed that they were poorly armed, so they would be easily controlled. So the Rebizi, unlike other major tribes, were not seen as worthy of any compensation or indeed consultation. Ali Mahwar immediately then appealed to the Yemeni government, who provided him with a small amount of arms and ammunition. So in late 1953 then, the working parties in the Wadi Hatib were attacked by the Ahl Shams, the Rebizi, and the building was subsequently suspended pending a major government operation to put down the revolt. On the 17th of November 1953, a squadron of the APL moved into the Wadi Hatib from two different directions, having first established an airfield on a nearby highland plateau. There was two different forces. The North Force of Operation Nothing Venture was quickly located by Ali Mahwar, and Rebizi snipers used the mountainous terrain then to inflict a number of casualties on the levies, including wounding one British non-commissioned officer. And despite a number of bombing sorties by Venom aircraft from 8th Squadron in Cormacsar, RAF officers reported that, quote, APL headquarters had to ultimately face facts and a truce was agreed with Ali Mahwar in order to negotiate a political solution, unquote. Now, information that a truce had been agreed either never reached the APL South Force or they decided to ignore it. But on 6th of December, South Force reached the village of Robat, essentially Ali Mahwar's capital of the Shamsi part of the Rebizi tribe. Ali Mahwar's aunt was killed in the ensuing engagement. Although some representatives of the Aden government blamed the APL for the killing, the RAF later accepted responsibility for her death and, quote, disciplinary action was taken against the pilot concerned. Not only had the APL RAF breached the truce, but they had killed a close relative of the leader of the Ahl Shams, and Ali Mahwar was indeed convinced that she had been murdered deliberately and also claimed that his house and other buildings had been looted by the APL. Nonetheless, the situation may have been salvaged at this point because all Ali Mahwar asked for in compensation was £15 and indeed 300 rounds of ammunition and an admission of guilt or fault on the part of the Sultan, who was at least nominally in the government authority in the Wadi Hatib. The request was refused. The response was also complicated by correspondence between the Colonial Office and the Air Ministry over who should pay the £15. So instead, what was decided was that a large APL force would move into the Wadi Hatib and construct a fort in the village of Robat to allow for the road building to continue. And to add to Shamsi grievances, the government guard compound at Robat was built on the site of Ali Mahwar's old fort, the latter being ripped down and used for construction material. So considerable effort already had been used considerable resources have already been used in defeating in attempting to defeat a tribal leader with a following of now estimated to be 100 armed tribesmen. And indeed, the government were confident because the Ahl Rebiz or the Rebizis were not very unified. And indeed, conflict within the tribe meant that the leading Rebizi chief, Sheikh Dahwal, even offered to send his son to act as to spot targets for the RAF. So this led to an overconfidence, perhaps, that they could divide the Rebizis and then suppress the Ahl Shams. But attacks on government forces by Ali Mahwar and the Shamsi continued to escalate throughout 1954, and indeed the convoys to resupply Robat Fort were extremely hazardous, despite frequent sorties by 8th Squadron and indeed APL flight before and during these convoy movements. Following a major attack on Robat Forts on the 2nd of May 1954, the fort had to be relieved by a combined operation, for example, of 186 government guards and APL, assisted by 21 RAF aircrafts. And successive sorties complained that they failed to find any targets. The Air Officer Commanding and Commander of British Forces Aden, Air Vice Marshal Sidney Bufton, decided to increase the tempo of the bombing campaign and widened the number of targets, including targeting cultivation, wells, to try and essentially sort of move to a more collective type punishment of the Shamsi population to try and force them into surrender. And indeed, in May 1954, Bufton sent Squadron Leader Pollock, who was the senior intelligence officer at Aden headquarters, to Robat to establish an air control post. There were no Rebizi attacks on Robat Fort during the 2 weeks of his stay. However, his reports do give a sense of the siege conditions that exist. One report indicated that Pollock had prepared, quote, a hot reception for the Rebizi, who he believed were trying to poison the fort's water supply. When Pollock was being extracted by the APL, that convoy was ambushed on 24th of May 1954. A number of APL were wounded. And now the AOC decided to up the ante even further. And he announced that a larger force of APL would now move into the Wadi Hatib. And he said that if the Rebizi did not submit by the 7th of June 1954, there would be an even greater use of bombing attacks in the Hatib area and a widening again of permissible targets, including to civilian houses. Government officials were then very confident that this new operation, called Operation Westboard, would work, and indeed they drew up plans to sentence Rebizi leaders to long prison sentences and to impose large fines. However, an overwhelming reliance upon air power and the failure to picket the mountain ridges during the long twisting convoy movements up the Hatib meant that although the bombing caused hardship for the Rebizi population, whose livestock, houses and wells were targeted, it failed to blunt their offensive against the government. In June 1954, the operations records for RAF Cormacsar reported that, quote, the results of the operation are not known and difficult to success, but 6 tribal houses in isolated positions were destroyed. The remainder of the attacks were directed against what little cultivation exists, waterholes and cattle. The AOC reported that 152 attacks had been made in the prescribed area, but that they struggled to find any targets in such an impoverished, barren area. Quote, the area is one of the most unpromising on which to exert air pressure. The only satisfaction was that the Rebizi seemed to be concerned at the destruction of some of the ilb trees. The ilb tree is a vital source of sugar to the population and is also used to treat wounds. It soon became clear that the Westport operation had energised rather than dampened the Rebizi insurgency. In July alone, Rebizi rebels launched 54 attacks on the fort at Robat. Rebels attacked government guard positions, also including in Nisab, targeting the political officer's house, and at other locations outside the Wadi Hatib. And they encouraged, indeed, other parts of the Rebizi Tribal Confederation now also moved into a position of open rebellion against the government. By the autumn of 1954, radio messages from the fort of Robat were becoming increasingly panicked as the government guards came under ever more intense attack almost on a daily basis. So really what we're looking at by early 1955 is a situation whereby the government has dropped a huge amount of ordnance in this area. It's used successive types of operations, but they are unable to suppress what was initially a very small-scale rebellion by an insignificant tribe. George Henderson, the political officer, reported by early 1955 that, according to him, the Shamsis had suffered no losses as a result of APL action, and that between October 1954 and April 1955 there had been 142 separate attacks on Robat Fort. Henderson was very critical of the APL. He's claimed that every departure from Hatib is a rather frantic disengaging action, with the levies obsessed by 2 thoughts. When will the aircraft come, and how soon will the Shamsis stop firing? Henderson's views were corroborated by the British agent, the senior political officer for the Western Protectorate, Kennedy Travaskis, who blamed the RAF regiment officers in charge of the APL. Quote, querulous officers make for querulous, near mutinous men. One levy corporal asked me, why should they risk their lives taking supplies to the government guards in the Wadi Hatib? The Wadi Hatib did not belong to us. It belongs to the Rebizis. It was our colonialism that was causing all this trouble, unquote. Travaskis now believed that the APL was dangerously subversive and should be removed from the Protectorate, a suggestion that was angrily rejected by the APL's officers, the RAF regiment, and indeed headquarters British Forces Aden. However, the commanding officer of the APL did confide to the Air Ministry that he was only able to use 4 out of the 6 APL squadrons in the Wadi Hatib, noting that, quote, in November 1954, an attempt to use tribal squadron in own general area resulted in 24 desertions en route. An entire squadron, quote, influenced by anti-British propaganda, had to be withdrawn to Aden from Nisab, having laid down their arms at the end of May. And the political advisor in Nisab believed that 2 other squadrons could not be relied upon and were also influenced by propaganda against, quote, the English colonizer. 38 soldiers were 38 levies were placed under close arrest. A large number of these were from Dathina state, which is just bordering the Upper Aulaki Sultanate. And the men complained not of political issues, but of the conditions of their service, including conducting operations during Ramadan, but also in areas that they'd never conducted operations in before, that were close to their homes. And colonial officials warned that this was because of Egyptian propaganda and also because of, quote, adverse influence emanating from the souk at Nisab. So the APL commander was also frequently talking about that really the problem here was not the sort of Egyptian-fed propaganda via Yemen, that really this was just about conducting operations in, Aulakis particularly, conducting operations in their own home territories. And so 180 men from both the APL and the government guards deserted in the 6 months leading up to 18th of May. And desertion rates these were not seen as surprising by the APL commander, who said, again, the colonial policy here is wrong. The APL needs to be completely redesigned if we're going to if we use them in areas, in recruitment areas that we rely upon. In spring 1955, Ali Mahwar sent the Aden government a peace proposal. He and his followers said they would swear not to attack government forces and government-administered areas if Robat Fort was returned to him, and no further attempt was made to seize control of the Wadi Hatib. So essentially he's offering co-option. The government concluded this was unacceptable since it would, quote, involve a considerable loss of face by the government. The political officer Nisab later reported that there was nonetheless an opportunity to make peace with the Shamsis. According to his sources, Al-Shams were not and never have been pro-Yemen rather than pro-British, but they simply wanted to eat. They respected the power of Britain, but did not understand why it was used to squash them. If the Shamsis were given a stipend of cash and weapons, the government guards were replaced by local tribal guards, and Ali Mahwar was compensated for the death of his aunt, then peace was possible. The political officer in Nisab was prepared to accept these terms and to rely upon the word of Ali Mahwar. And his rather cynical report, however, on 5th of June said that they would make a temporary peace until they had built up the forces to crush the Shamsi in the future. So negotiations seemed promising, but there was no let-up in the interim on punitive government actions against the Shamsis in the Wadi Hatib. In May 1955, a full wing of the APL, supported by 8th Squadron and APL flight, moved into Wadi Hatib to seize cattle, sheep and goats and to confiscate grain and destroy other food supplies. On the 20th of May, a routine convoy to Robat was ambushed. One APL levy was killed and 2 government guards wounded. It was decided after this that a bigger force was needed now to resupply Robat. And so on the 15th of June 1955, a convoy of 6 British officers, 5 Arab officers and 97 NCOs, other ranks, under the command of Wing Commander Rodney Marshall, set out from Rousses for Robat, an 8-hour journey up the twisting tracks of the Wadi Hatib and neighbouring valleys. Marshall carefully planned the outward journey, and indeed he asked for and received, quote, maximum air support from 8th Squadron in RAF Cormacsar. He organised small reconnaissance parties to push out ahead of the main convoy, and he agreed preemptive airstrikes on likely Shamsi ambush sites. Taking cover where they could, the convoy then proceeded caterpillar-like up the Wadi Hatib. Here you can see this is the valley they're moving up. Very high mountains on either side. They arrived in Robat in the early afternoon. They were not attacked at all on the entry into Robat. They rested and they prepared then for the return journey. Shortly after leaving the fort, the convoy was ambushed here at the Najd Sada pass here, which was actually a perfect ambush site, really, for the Rebizi, which had been clearly carefully planned. Shamsi power then, Rebizi firepower was exact and unrelenting. Flight Lieutenant John Lee was killed in the first moments of a well-prepared ambush. On the rear convoy near the Najd Sada Pass, Wing Commander Marshall and an APL officer, Mulazim Ahwal Kotebi, were killed before they could evacuate the convoy from the kill zone. Indeed, the convoy got stuck, and that's why Squadron Leader Jock Stewart, who was awarded the Military Cross because he was able to evacuate, basically sort of go. He came back, he was near the front of the convoy, he was able to get back to the rear under fire and basically managed to reorganize the convoy to extract themselves from what was, quickly becoming an extremely dangerous, clearly a very lethal place to stay for even a number of seconds, never mind minutes. 5 other ranks then were also killed and 7 were wounded in this ambush. On the 28th of June, so shortly after this, 1955, orders were issued for another convoy movement to Robat, but 19 levies immediately deserted. So the order was rescinded while there was discussions in Aden and Government House about what to do about the situation in Robat and the Wadi Hatib. At a meeting on the 18th of June then, the AOC acknowledged that, quote, they, the Shamsis, do not appear to be afraid of air attack, against which they have learned to utilise the full protection afforded by the terrain. And it was noted that although thousands of air sorties and a huge amount of ordnance had been used against the Rebizis, really it was having very little effect. They were too dug in, they were too concealed within the terrain, and air power was failing. In a special report for the Air Ministry, Air Commodore Dudley Radford, a former commander of 8th Squadron who had served in Aden and East Africa, concluded that, quote, it is difficult to see how reinforcements could be used effectively in the Protectorate. Only trained indigenous guerrilla fighters can chase these tribesmen on their own ground. Unquote. This was effectively an acknowledgement by the military that the strategy to date, heavy reliance upon air power and supported by a relatively small APL force and static government guards, had failed. Air Commodore Radford's report was equally damning on the performance of the Colonial Office and the Aden government. Radford concluded that, quote, reconnaissance has clearly shown that the construction of a road through this area would be barely practical and extremely costly. I doubt whether the original conception would stand searching examination, unquote. In total, 24 APL, or government guards, including 2 RAF regiments officers, had been killed between December 1953 and June 1955. An additional 40 had been seriously wounded. Only 4 or 5 Shamsi fighters were believed by the RAF to have been killed during that time. According to Air Commodore Radford, all the RAF, APL and government guards efforts had really been for no realistic political purpose. The government in Aden acknowledged that withdrawal from Robat would reduce unbearable wastage for both the APL and the government guards. However, a truce or peace deal with Ali Mahwar was now out of the question since 2 British officers had been killed. Officials in the Colonial Office were concerned that abandoning the fort under such conditions would have, quote, an extremely adverse effect politically on the prestige of the British Empire and indeed in the Protectorate as a whole. It would, according to Travaskis, effectively mean abandon the road building project, quote, thus conceding victory to the Yemeni policy. So the situation in the Upper Awlaki had evolved to where a very small tribal insurgency, seen as insignificant 18 months earlier, was now perceived by colonial officials as a litmus test of the British Empire. An important plank of the forward policy, however, according to Air Commodore Radford, the road through Wadi Hatib was rotten. The advice of the RAF and the Air Ministry was unambiguous. The APL should not be sacrificed to pursue such a misguided policy by the Colonial Office. Withdrawal from Robat was required and should be implemented without delay. Air Vice Marshal Buffton pointed out the danger in blunt terms. Quote, Robat has been our heaviest operational commitment and is the rock upon which a rock which threatens to destroy the Aden Protectorate Levies and the government guards. Robat is the worst wicket in the Protectorate, and it is unwise to go on playing the Yemen on such ground. Attempts by the governor to get the British government, the government in London, to overrule the Air Ministry and Buffton, halting the withdrawal from Robat, were rejected. And the operation in July 1955 to evacuate Robat was an enormous show of force, which was aimed at, quote, limiting a loss of face. So they were leaving, but they used 4 APL squadrons, a government guard squadron, 2 flights from the RAF regiment, which were reinforced by 1st Battalion Seaforth Highlanders -1 company and an armoured squadron from the Life Guards. Other forts in the region were also abandoned. Much of the Wadi Hatib fell straight back into the hands of Ali Mahwar. Kennedy Travaskis, however, did concede that the withdrawal calmed the situation in the Western Protectorates, and indeed that the situation was much less violent and the government were able to exert control in other areas that had recently seen disturbances prior to the evacuation of Robat. So Travaskis acknowledged that things were quieter and that things seemed a bit more secure and that the APL could also be put back on a more steady footing. So with the withdrawal complete then, the priority for the Air Ministry officials was addressing APL grievances and restoring and rebuilding the force. Both APL wings were removed from operations and given 3 months of rehabilitation and training. They were given a pay increase. And in the interim, Air Vice Marshal Buffton arranged for British Army reinforcements to remain in Aden, to come to Aden and remain in Aden until the spring of 1956, which would allow for a phased APL return to operations. They were given new rifles, light machine guns. A new armoured car squadron crewed by the RAF regiment was established as part of a new 3rd APL wing. And indeed, there was also a commitment made not to send new recruits on major operations within the first year of the service, and indeed to not use, to avoid using levies within their own territories. This was particularly aimed at the Awlaki levies, who'd recently been so perturbed by the operations in the Wadi Hatib. So there was some negotiations going on about where and how APL levies would be used, and that was mostly done through the junior officers, the kind of mulazim type ranks of the APL. And thanks to these measures and of course the withdrawal from the Wadi Hatib, morale and discipline indeed slowly recovered in late 1955 and early 1956. While the Air Force concentrated on rebuilding the fractured Loyalist bargain between the levies and their RAF regiment officers, the Aden administration plotted a way to prevent the Air Ministry and the RAF from undermining their expansionist forward policy in the future. In this endeavour, the colonial authorities skillfully manipulated long-standing inter-service rivalries, such as Huw talked about earlier, to their advantage. During the summer of 1955, the Aden government conspired with the War Office in London to blame RAF regiment officers for the debacle at Robat and the problems in the APL, rather than forward policy itself. Following his involvement in the evacuation, Major Kenneth Dyaker of the Life Guards received a confidential request from the War Office for, quote, a report on how the RAF regiment worked or did not, and any other bad points that you noticed that can be used against them, unquote. Major Dyaker obliged, writing of the RAF regiment's, quote, bad NCOs and mediocre officers, unquote, who were attached to the APL, an assessment that overlooked successive decorations for bravery and leadership, including, of course, 2 military crosses awarding to British APL officers and NCOs during operations in the Wadi Hatib. Dyaker's report was instrumental in having the RAF regiment replaced by the British Army in the Protectorate, a reversal, of course, of the handover in 1948. And the War Office request for, quote, bad points was indeed very unorthodox, since it bypassed the normal chain of command. However, the Life Guards enjoyed a connection with the Secretary of State for War, Brigadier Anthony Head, who had served from 1928 to 1946 as an officer in that regiment. And indeed, in September 1955, Head requested that an Army Brigadier be appointed to take command of new Land Forces headquarters in Aden. The Air Ministry hoped the appointment would be temporary and that the RAF regiment would retain its lead role over land operations in the future, but instead, of course, the Army steadily increased its presence in Saudi Arabia during the next 5 years, replacing the RAF as a service in command of the Aden Protectorate Levies in February 1957, and shortly afterwards embarking on a new and also failed operation to build a road through the Wadi Hatib. So I'm now going to hand over to Huw, who will just sum up some of the strategic consequences of this operation and these events that I've just been talking about. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, I'll keep it brief so that we can get on to questions and some discussion about this episode. Oh, I think you missed your lovely portraits at the end of some of the key figures. Now, of course, as Ed pointed out, towards the end of this episode, there's clear evidence that the Aden Protectorate Levies were given a rest, were reformed, that there was some recovery, improvement in discipline, and that the door could be shut on this period of great controversy and difficulty. However, this wasn't the end of the story, because there would in the future be further episodes of that Loyalist bargain breaking down, and there being serious discontent within the APL and in the successor formation, the Federal Regular Army, and in the police counterparts too. So, of course, the forward policy didn't really go away either, and we can see that the creation of the Federation of South Arabia was in some ways a different way of packaging those old aspirations of colonial officials in Aden to create a modern state in the region that was very much in the British image or very much influenced by Britain and would have good relations with the UK after independence. And this process did not go well. It was resisted, and there continued to be fighting in the areas that we've been talking about and in other parts of the countryside outside of Aden, as well as in the city too, in the Aden insurgency, which is normally considered to run from 1963 or 64 up until the British departure in late 1967. But I think we can see, from what we've been talking about today about what was happening in the 1950s, there's a lot of continuity. So really this idea that the insurgency in Aden was just a kind of late 1960s affair is not really capturing those aspects of continuity over several decades, and perhaps going back even further. Now, as Ed was talking about, we increasingly see in the archive records from this period, the late 50s into the 60s, a growing emphasis by British officials across different government departments, in the Army and the Air Force. There's a lot of consensus on this point, that really the source of all the problems, it boils down to those Yemenis, those troublesome Yemenis over the border, and their more recent allies, the Egyptians. It's very difficult to disentangle that interference from what's actually going on in Aden and the protectorates in the countryside in the late 50s and in the 1960s. It's very difficult to judge the degree to which there really was an insurgency being driven by outsiders against the kind of feeling you get that there's a collective paranoia. It's easier to blame the Egyptians and to blame the Yemenis for meddling than it is to say maybe the Adenese population don't want us here anymore. So it's very difficult to figure that out when you're looking at the archival material. Certainly, the British are very concerned from the late 50s into the 60s that propaganda from the Yemen and especially from Egypt, the Egyptians are seen as masters of modern propaganda. They have a number of radio stations that they're broadcasting material into the protectorates and into Aden with, for example, using other forms of propaganda too. There is certainly some effect of that on not just the population, but on the local security forces too, on the Federal Regular Army. So we do see further incidences of that bargain, of that deal between the local allies and the British breaking down. Desertions, minor mutinies, then just before the British withdrawal, a major mutiny where a number of people are killed. So what's clear, though, I think the benefit of looking back into the 1950s is to see that actually this very dramatic and well-known mutiny at the end of the British presence had been preceded by similar instances earlier on a fairly regular basis. And what's so fascinating is to try and work out how far that is down to that foreign propaganda, stirring things up, stirring up discontent, how much it's down to things like poor relations between commanders and soldiers, poor leadership in other words, how far it's down to material factors like pay. Ed was talking about this pay increase that was given at one point, and how far it's down to the actual nature of the fighting itself and where people are being asked to fight. So I think there's a lot more to be discovered on this issue of the role of these local security forces and how they interact with the British strategy at the higher level, and how that had an influence upon the decision to withdraw from Aden in the end. And I think we'd better leave it at that point. Yeah.
Okay, Huw, Ed, I really enjoyed that talk. It was fascinating to hear some of the detail. Yes, you're not going to escape, Ed, so
yeah.
Jump up. We've had a really interesting question from our online audience to kick off, and it's from Jonathan Kempster. And he says, many British Army servicemen who have been interviewed described Aden as being a punishment posting. How true do you feel that might have been for the RAF, and did it differ between airmen and regiment?
I think I'll talk about the Army first and then let Ed say something about the Air Force. I think what you get is absolutely a kind of Marmite reaction to being sent to Aden. And when you read some of the accounts, especially those of officers who ended up in the local forces for a longer period of time in the APL or in the Federal Regular Army or in the Federal Guards, the sort of police equivalent, that many of them actually kind of fell in love with the place and fell in love with the people. And then you have this kind of really romantic depiction of the Arabs that are very similar to kind of 19th century, colonialist accounts of colonial officers in Egypt, or in other parts of the world, having a little bit of a deluded idea of what the local people thought of them, a very kind of overly rosy and optimistic take on it. So I think in general terms, you could probably draw a contrast between those officers who spent a lot of time in the place and ended up forming this very positive outlook on the place and the people, and those who were perhaps more passing through. Ed talked about some of the regiments who were sent for specific operations for a short period of time, then they went back to their normal base in Egypt or in East Africa or the UK or somewhere else. They probably had a very different kind of response to being sent to Aden.
Yeah, I just briefly add to that as well. I think after what happens in Suez and the evacuation of the Canal Zone, I think Aden then takes on a different meaning for the army. So suddenly it's seen as more prestigious because the army needs to consolidate its presence in the Middle East, and so it doesn't have Egypt now. So Aden shifts in terms of being a backwater, perhaps, on the army side to being something much more important, and they want it. I think in the case of the RAF, because really Aden has been a sort of jewel in the RAF, since 1928, and so it's seen as much more prestigious for RAF officers to be there, including from the regiment. I would also say that the regiment is also, interestingly, it's quite a new, it's a new entity within the RAF, and it is also quite, in terms of recruiting, its officers are quite diverse. The regiment is open to talented late entry NCOs, or NCOs have been commissioned as officers. And so I think they're a fascinating entity at this time in terms of having some, yes, they're consolidating as an institution, so as a regiment, but they also have some very capable officers who come from more diverse backgrounds than perhaps some of the more traditional army regiments. And so they like Aden because Aden gives them space and opportunity, and they're serving under an AOC.
Yeah. Okay, do we have any questions in the room? Because I've got lots of questions, so that's fine. Okay, I thought the similarities, as you were talking, between Aden and the Northwest Frontier in the interwar period were quite stark in terms of trying to control rural areas because of the impact that disruption in those areas might have on the areas which you're actually concerned about. And then as we get towards road building, pushing into those areas to try and open up the country, there's, again, real similarities there. Perhaps the difference being the RAF's enthusiasm to try and prove that air power can do a job in these areas. I mean, is that something which, in your, having researched it in more detail, does seem to resonate, or are there real differences between those two particular examples?
No, I think it does resonate, and I think it goes beyond that into the recent past and the present as well. That it's a deep kind of intrinsic part of liberal democracy that there's suspicion of ungoverned spaces. That there are fragile states or rogue states of some kind, where if there isn't a stable political order that we recognise and we think is likely to produce peace, then something needs to be done about it. If we don't deal with the chaos over there, then the chaos will come to our streets, right? It's a very similar logic to the last couple of decades and the war on terror. So I think it's a fear of the unknown to a large extent that drives that kind of demand for something to be done.
I feel the different. I don't know if you've got something which you want to comment on there.
Just very, very quickly add in terms of air policing. I think it's within the RAF, within the headquarters in Aden. It's interesting to see how early the regiment officers recognise the problem that they have. So from 1950, early 54, they're talking about this is not working in Robat, the Wadi Hatib. This is a bad idea. And the AOC also sort of Buffton kind of recognises that too. But Buffton's also interested. He's thinking about the pilots, and he's saying it's a really good opportunity to test the Venoms, the Venom aircraft, and let's see how many sorties we can do next time. They're actually using it as a bit of a testing ground, a Cold War testing ground for some aircraft. And so, whereas the regiment are concerned about controlling territory and the ground and cohesion within, and thinking about loyalist allies, they don't have the power within the RAF, within the service, and so they don't get listened to. And it's the same with RAF intelligence. And that is something even to think about a contemporary sense, is that sometimes, there are in terms of listening to people on the ground who have insights but may not hold traditional senior rank. The regiment I think the regiment was repeatedly ignored. And so that was one of the flaws in air policing, is that the RAF had people who knew things on the ground, who spoke languages, and they just didn't necessarily prioritise that information. They were sometimes too busy thinking about the Venom aircraft and how was it performing, and other sort of bigger, other sort of interesting issues that pilots were particularly fascinated by.
Yeah, we've got another good question online, but before we move away from this, I think the question I have for this road building, I mean, for a lot of time, as I said, on the Northwest Frontier, it seems to be by building this road, we'll create economic opportunities, we'll open the country, we can move trade. There is an economic rationale, even if it's perhaps flawed. What's the underlying rationale for building this road other than just control? Is there one?
The rationale is military, in that there are some potential economic opportunities of thinking maybe there's oil somewhere out there up in the Western Protectorate that we haven't quite, there's some rumours of potential oil reserves that would be good to have a road leading up. But essentially I do think it is about consolidating the control of the border and having a major archery that runs, very adjacent to the Yemeni border, in which you can rapidly move large amounts of forces. They are also thinking about the changing picture within the Gulf in terms of a more aggressive Saudi Arabia as well. And whereas the consolidated relationship with Saudi Arabia that we know later in the Cold War did not quite exist at that point. So there are sort of regional strategic interests that they're thinking about with the road. So it is about consolidated military control, and it's also against hedging, I think, in case of future events. But for the RAF, they're essentially thinking, they're weighing it up in a different way to the Colonial Office and the Army. They're thinking, will this incentivize more insurgency than would otherwise be the case? We think it will. That's the Air Ministry's conclusion. And therefore, this is going to harm Cormac Sar and the port rather than consolidate it. And the Army and the War Office have a very different view, and the Colonial Office have a very different view. Yeah.
Okay. Typically my laptop has turned itself off just as I was about to go to that question. So does anyone have a question in the room whilst I try and get it online? Yes. Sorry, so I'm going to ask you to take the mic, because otherwise...
I may be missing the point. Sorry, Jim Sheen, my name is. Huw, you said early doors about the British arming tribes on the other side of the border to come across, and was that so that they could get the tribes they were attacking on their side? In which case, you're sort of like arming the enemy to build your own team up.
Yeah, so the covert action that was taking place, I mean, there was some army involvement, but it was mainly in the charge of the colonial authorities and also the intelligence agencies as well. They were working with the intelligence services, was to work with the tribes that straddled the border.
Yeah.
So there were some operations with tribes in the Yemen that were largely based there, but it was mainly trying to work with those that were across the border. And the supply of weapons was both to use the weapons for violence, but also because weapons were a form of currency. So it's a way of kind of buying loyalty and buying support rather than cash or gold or anything else. Rifles would purchase you influence for some time to come. Yeah.
If you're trying to control the border and you're arming that opposite side,
yeah,
then you are what is the point in that? You're offering you're giving them the option to come.
Well, so the idea, so there's two options, right? Either you stabilise the border and you seal it in some way, and you use kind of conventional operations to make sure that the border isn't a source of instability, or you recognise that you don't have the manpower to do that. That's going to take probably tens of thousands of troops to be able to do that. It'd be very expensive and take a long time. The nature of the border is that it, as with, say, the Pakistan-Afghanistan border as well, that it is fluid, that there are people that move across it on a very regular basis, that those populations that straddle the border are going to be players in this in one way or another, and you can either choose to have them on your team or they're going to be on the opposition's team. Do you see what I mean? So it's a zero-sum game. If you don't bribe them and pay them off and give them rifles and so on, then somebody else is going to do it instead. So they're not a neutral party. They're either going to come with you or... And of course, many of these tribes played a very clever game, and they were taking bribes from both sides at the same time. They weren't stupid. They knew how to play it to their own advantage.
It was also a very fluid time in the history of the Yemeni imamate, or the Yemeni state, in that it was deeply unpopular in terms of its own expansion, trying to expand its own power in the border region, in the northern border region, and they were very unpopular with many of the tribes within their own territory. So a real opportunity for Aden government then to try and sow political dissent and undermine who they saw as their enemies, essentially.
Yeah, it's very unstable in Yemen itself. Once the Imam dies, his son takes over and is very unpopular, and that's really the beginnings of the revolution in Yemen. Once that happens, there's a civil war going on in Yemen for a number of years, And then the Egyptians become involved, and the Egyptians have thousands of military advisors there who are doing quite a lot more than just, you know, giving training lessons. There's a serious Egyptian military presence there too. So, it is, you can, on the one hand, you can say the British are quite paranoid about it and they could have just kind of left it alone. But actually, as time goes on, it moves more into the 1960s. It really is very, very volatile in the north.
Okay, so we've got a question from Tony Craig, and he asks, have you come across any sources or resources that give an indication of the Indigenous APL troops' experiences and feelings? How did they square working with Britain and compare that to their tribal or national loyalties?
Yeah, so this is a really important point. This is a major difficulty, and it's where you can draw big comparisons between the very little work that's been done on the APL with other types of imperial or colonial forces, right? So when we wrote the chapter that this lecture's been based upon, we started out by doing a survey and said, well, how have other people gone about this with other colonial forces? And of course, the big one is the British Indian Army. And there's a massive research and writing. There have been thousands of interviews have been done with soldiers who are in the Indian Army. The sort of the ordinary soldiers, view from the ground up, if you like. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of written sources as well. Now, so that's the ideal, because then when you're looking at this question of loyalty and desertions, mutinies and so on, you can then take it from the two angles and you can say, well, okay, what are the officers saying? Why do they think this was happening? How do they explain these mutinies? And then you can go and ask the soldiery and say, well, is that true? And often they'll say, no, that's absolutely nothing to do with it. We were discontent about pay, or we just didn't like this commander. He was a real, difficult one and we hated him. So with the APL, that type of source doesn't exist. The best that we can get on that is that in this period through the 50s and the 60s, these are in the British Library. Anyone can go and look at these sources in the British Library. These desertions were happening on a fairly frequent basis, and quite often, because the soldiers would just go home, the British ended up capturing the deserter. So when they did, they gave them quite a lengthy interrogation about, what's going on? Why have you done this? Because they wanted to know, was it because of the Egyptian propaganda? Was it because there was a ringleader in the unit who was kind of, psyching people up and encouraging them to desert? They wanted to be able to sort of pin it down. So that's really the only source of any detail that we've got that gives that perspective from the ordinary soldiers in the APL about how they felt about things. But even that, of course, is mediated through the British translator, the British, transcriber writing everything down. So we don't have the kind of the pure voice of the ordinary soldiers.
Just briefly add to that, Hughes. Well, I think sometimes looking at actions is a way good at corroborating theories that are advanced by. So the colonial office have a view. It's Egypt's fault. It's Yemen's propaganda. It's the souk. It's political. And then the APL British officers clearly have a very different. The regiment have a different view, and that they think it's more local and they can be fixed through things like pay. Thinking about not putting certain squadrons in certain areas for long periods of time, particularly their recruiting areas. Important recruiting areas. And if you look at which squadrons actually do mutiny, two of them have large Aulaki recruits, right? So that's in the files. So clearly the Aulakis are not happy, deploying in their own area for these type of operations. So whereas if there's less mutinying from other squadrons that are less Aulaki, then that shows that maybe this isn't a kind of macro Arab, pan-Arab descent, Egyptian-fueled kind of mutiny. Maybe this is actually, I would think that to some extent actions back up the regiment and APL officers' view of this, which is a bit more localized. I mean, there is an anti-colonial sentiment, certainly, but it does seem that the local is very, very important in terms of just looking at actions. The other thing is that the intercepts of Yemeni intelligence can be useful as well, in that you have to take it at face value that the British intelligence officer who is intercepting reports from the Yemeni state is not making them up, but the Yemenis also talk to deserters from the APL, and then that information is captured and recycled back to Aden. So you can take that with a pinch of salt, but it can be useful in terms of, if this is real intelligence as opposed to fabrication, then what they're saying to the Yemeni state may be of interest. But the problem with that is that they tend to play up political, so they tend to play, we feel very Yemeni, because of course they're outside their home area and they're looking for money, support, food. So it is interesting to see what they're saying in Yemen, but it does come up, it does have similar problems. So it's a very good question from Tony Craig. It is something that is extremely difficult, and it's something that we're trying to work through at present in terms of looking to think about ways to tap into Yemeni sources that maybe haven't been used in the literature yet. So,
okay, we've got 2 online questions, but I think we've only really got time for one big one. And I'm conscious that I've only taken one from in the room. So if there's a question anyone wants to ask, it's a speak now or forever hold your peace. You're going to regret, you're going to get down to that train station and think, I wish I'd asked that. Okay, so we've got a question from Mac, who says, interestingly, the regiment's antecedents, the RAF armoured car companies, had a great deal of success in Iraq, as they had a close relationship with the flying squadrons during the interwar period. Was this relationship lost or in some way different by the time we get to Aden? And I think I just tack on to that. Does that differ in terms of when you're operating in the plains of Iraq compared to when you get to the hills in Kurdistan?
Do you want to answer that, because you've been thinking about Iraq? You've been thinking about the comparison recently.
Yeah, I mean, I think the armoured car squadrons are interesting, and clearly, you can see some of the effect, and you can see how the British to some extent have better political options and very robust allies who they can use against insurgents, whether it's the Kurds or others. But I would add a major caveat to that. So if you look at the Assyrian levies, who make up a large portion of what is known as the Iraq levies, again, largely RAF officered, there's also army officers there too. But it's the Assyrians, there are 2 squadrons that, mutiny at one point. There's a major, very discreet, because this is not something that the British want to be known necessarily in Whitehall, but there is very discreet negotiations going on with the Assyrians, who are seen as ostensibly very loyal, because they are really banking on British power to sort of try and consolidate their interests within Iraq. And I think we need to be very careful about that, because certainly the papers that are available, for example, in the National Army Museum on the Assyrian levies, show that at various points they refuse to follow orders, they won't do certain operations. Some of them are simply just dismissed. They're just, basically the RAF say that, we don't need your services anymore, you're too disloyal. So it's a much more mixed picture than has been, I think, than some of the literature out there sort of says, that it's actually much more fluid. That doesn't mean that the Iraq levies aren't very useful. They don't have serious effect against insurgents in Iraq. They do. But I don't know if this I would be careful about a contrast to sort of APL major problems, Iraq smooth in the 20s, 30s. I think it's much more patchy than perhaps we need more work on it.
I think wrap up on these 2, one of which I'm hoping is a quite short answer, and the other is to do with more reading on this area. So the first is, did you use oral history sources when researching? And the second is, are there any suggestions for further reading for those who wish to know more about this time period in general in Aden?
Yeah, the only oral history sources that we could get access to, because of the problem that I discussed earlier, were from the Imperial War Museum Sound Archive, and a lot of that is online now. That's a brilliant resource, and that was from colonial officials and British officers seconded to the APL. So it's really only from the white British perspective. There's a number of very good books on the Aden insurgency in the 1960s. Is it Jonathan Walker's Aden insurgency? That's the main study. That's very good. There's also a book on this whole period in Aden and the protectorates by Spencer Morby, who's at Nottingham University in the history department, about British policy in Aden and the protectorates. And there is one book by Frank Edwards on the APL itself. So that is essential reading, is Frank Edwards' book on the APL, which he actually wrote, I think, at the end of the 60s. So he had access to a lot of sources at the time, but it wasn't published until much later. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think all that's left to do is, both for our online audience and those in person, is to thank you both for a fantastic talk. So thank you very much, Huw and Ed.
Thank you.